Morning, it's Miss Beth here for History Hullabaloo, and it may be really hot outside because it's August, but today we're going to learn about a part of history that was very, very cold, and that was Arctic exploration and the hardships endured by all those who decided to go to the North Pole and explore those regions that were hardly ever explored before. So, as you can see, I'm dressed up pretty warm here, and as I go along, I'm going to show you some of these photos that I have. Hopefully you can see them. And I have a bunch of these, and these are called primary sources. And if you don't know what a primary source is, maybe you've never heard that term before. A primary source is anything that was created by the person that lived at that time. So photos like these are primary sources, journals, diaries, even clothing can be primary sources. And the main thing to remember about that is they aren't reproductions, they aren't things that were created later. They were created by the actual men and women who lived at that time. And that's why they can tell us a lot about that period of time in history. So as we look at these photos and I show them to you, I want you to think about a few things, like what does the clothing tell you about that time in history? What is, let's see, what do the hairstyles tell you? What is, I have a picture of a boat here. What does that tell you compared to the big yachts and the big cruise ships you see today? It doesn't look as fancy as that, does it? So all these things can help you learn about that time period in history. So first off, like I said, I'm wearing some really warm clothing today. It's a parka with some fur on the hood and a scarf, and I have my mittens and my jacket here. So this is what all the explorers would have worn to the Arctic back 100 years ago when they were exploring there, except for it wouldn't have been made out of the same material as it is today. They would have made it out of things like seal skin and actual fur from animals, and bear skin and leather, and that all worked together to keep it waterproof and very, very warm for them. So you may be thinking, why did they even want to go to the frigid Arctic if it was so hard and so cold? Well, the Arctic was one of the last places on Earth to be explored back then. Every other piece of land, for the most part, we have discovered and we knew about. But the Arctic was the last place in the world that they really didn't know anything about it. They didn't know what kind of animals lived up there or what they would really find. In fact, there was one theory that was floating around at the time, about 100 years ago, that said that there was a warm polar ocean up there. Where you could find all sorts of tropical birds and fish and trees, and it would just be this paradise land up there. And we know now that that is not the case. That proved to be wrong, and there's nothing up there but cold snow and ice. But a few things do live up there, animals such as reindeer and Arctic fox and Arctic birds and seals and walrus and whales, and even some native tribes such as the Inuit. Here's a picture of what they look like, and they always are dressed in their warm clothing, and they raise these dogs here that help them pull their sleds across the ice and help them live up there. So what was it like to go on one of these adventures up to the Arctic, you may be wondering, because it's something you have never experienced before. Well, the explorers would travel by ship. Here is the ship that we're going to be reading about today. It was called the Roosevelt, and it wasn't very big, and it wasn't very fancy. It was pretty basic, made out of wood, powered by coal and steam, and they would pack enough supplies on this ship not for just days or weeks or months, but 2 to 3 years, because that's how long it would take to go on these explorations and these adventures. They would sail in the middle of summer up from places like California and such, and by the time they made it way up north, it would be winter time. So they'd have to winter down in the ice up there. Here's a picture of what it looks like up there with all the ice floes. So when the ice started to freeze their ship in place, that's when they would camp out for a few months until the spring thaw happened and they were able to move again. So they packed enough supplies, like I said, to go for 2 or 3 years, and this included plenty of warm clothing, plenty of food, and enough coal and stuff to steam them and power them up there for these years. So the kinds of foods they would bring would be canned goods and jerky and oatmeal and beans and coffee, sugar, lemon juice for vitamin C, everything to keep them healthy for all this time. So as you can imagine, these voyages were very challenging and hard, and a lot of people didn't make it. Men such as Ernest Shackleton and George DeLong, you may have heard of these men before. They were all unsuccessful in the Arctic adventures. And in fact, no one made it to the North Pole, which is at the top of the world here on my map. No one made it up to the North Pole, all the way up here, until a man named Matthew Henson and another man named Robert E. Peary made it up there in 1909 on the Roosevelt, which I had showed you. And today we're going to be reading about them in our book. Before we get started, I want to show you a picture of Robert Peary dressed up in his warm Arctic clothing with his sled dog to help him travel across the ice there. And you can see that he has all this fur-lined clothing, and it looks really super cold. And then Matthew Henson. A fun, important, interesting fact about Matthew Henson was he was an African American. And so not only was he one of the first men to make it up to the North Pole, but he was one of the first African Americans to make it up there too. And here's the rest of their crew. As you can see, they're cooks and cabin boys and people who fed the coal into the ovens to keep the ship going. All of them very important to the adventure. So, that being said, let's start our story. And it's going to teach us all about their adventure up there. It's called Keep On, the story of Matthew Henson, co-discoverer of the North Pole. It's written by Deborah Hawkinson and published by Peachtree. So let's get started. Here's Matthew Henson right here, and it gives us a little background on him. It says, Matthew Henson was born in a Maryland cabin at a time when boys dreamed of finding glory, of planting flags at the ends of the earth, making the unknown known, and recording their names in the history books. Young Matt had that same hunger to explore, but most folks would have laughed at his dreams. For Matt was born in 1866, just after the Civil War, a time when poor black boys like him had few chances to roam the next county, to say nothing of another country, the seven seas, or the top of the world. By the time he was 13, Matt was alone. He set out to make his way in the world, trudging the long road from Washington to the harbor of Baltimore. What a bustling place it was. Gulls screeched, men shouted and rushed about, loading and unloading ships of every size. And Matt stood alone, keen as an Arctic fox, eager to pounce on any chance he could find. So already he's wandered off on his own to find new adventures and a new life. Matt spied the Katie Hines, a three-masted vessel, another name for a ship, so sharp and bright she seemed like a star gliding in water. And when he spotted her proud, white-haired captain right here, Matt begged for a chance to go to sea. It was breaking the rules to let a boy under 15 sail, but that old sea dog took a liking to him, and Matthew Alexander Henson became his cabin boy. And throughout this book, you'll find actual words that Matthew Henson wrote in his diary, which is another primary source, by the way, and I'll read you some of these. This is actually what he wrote. It says, I shipped as cabin boy on board a vessel bound for China. After my first voyage, I became an able-bodied seaman sailing to China, Japan, North Africa, Spain, France, and through the Black Sea to southern Russia. For the next 5 years, Matt's school was the world. His classroom the boat. Captain Childs taught him history and math, and soon Matt could navigate by the stars, tie sailor's knots, and fix or build almost anything. After Captain Childs died, Matt left the sea, unsure of his course. He was working in a store in Washington, D.C., when a naval engineer named Robert E. Peary came looking for a hat and found an assistant besides. Remember we mentioned Robert E. Peary, this guy right here? Traveled with him. Matt proved so able that Peary asked him to join his next expedition to Greenland. Soon Matt realized Peary's heart was set on one goal, to be the first to stand at the very top of the world. But the pole was not an easy prize, and Peary and Matt had much to learn about the harsh, cold north. Matt studied with new teachers now, the Inuit. Of all the explorers who entered their world, Matt was their favorite, and they gave him the nickname Mari Palek, Matthew the Kind One. And right here, Matt writes, I have come to love these people. I know every man, woman, and child in their tribe, and they are my friends and regard me as theirs. So you can see their dogs there, and their house built out of ice, and they're all wearing the warm fur parkas. Matt took the time to listen, to learn their language, and to make friends. He studied how to build and drive a dog sledge, and how to dress and hunt in order to survive. Hardworking, skilled, and kind, Matt Henson earned the respect of everyone. He says, 8 days out and not a shot, not a sight of game, nothing. The night is coming quickly, the long months of darkness, of quiet and cold, that in spite of my years of experience, I can never get used to. So that's another thing. Up in the Arctic and the North Pole, during the winter time, the sun actually doesn't come out. It doesn't rise in the sky during the day, so it's constantly dark for those winter months because it's so high at the top of the world. Through years of struggle and heartbreak, the explorers faced furious storms, the shifting ice, and always the unrelenting, desperate cold. In fact, it could get to 40 degrees below zero, and sometimes even 50. That is pretty cold. On Peary's 1906 expedition, he and Matt set a record, reaching farther north than anyone had before. But storms forced them back. The top of the world was still out of reach, nearly 200 miles away. So they got caught in the ice and the winter storm and were forced to turn around. It just got too bad for them. The wind would find the tiniest opening in our clothing and pierce us with the force of driving needles. Our hoods froze to our growing beards, and when we were halted, we had to break away the ice that had been formed. Peary was determined to make one final try. And so on July 6th, 1908, which is a little over 100 years ago, Peary's team of explorers set sail again on the Roosevelt, a ship that we saw earlier. A ship so strong it could push through the Arctic ice. They spent the winter locked in the frozen sea, readying sledges, supplies, food, stoves, and more than 200 dogs. They hauled everything by dog sledge to the northernmost tip of Ellesmere Island. From this base camp, they would launch Peary's last attempt for the pole. The dogs were double fed, and we put a good meal inside ourselves before turning in on the night of February 28, 1909. The next morning was to be our launching, and we went to sleep full of the thought of what was before us. On March 1st, 1909, Peary and Henson's team set out across the frozen polar sea, over endless ridges of sharp, drifting ice, aiming for one point on the ice at the top of the world, 413 miles away. Peary's plan used support teams of men and dogs to break trail, build igloos, which were their ice houses, their ice huts, and haul and cache supplies, inching the assault forward day by day. But there were only enough supplies for one small team to make the fast and final dash of 5 grueling marches, 133 miles more. Day and night were the same, he says. My thoughts were on the going and getting forward and on nothing else. Traveling was slow, and the dogs became demons at one time, sullen and stubborn, then wildly excited and savage. Like can only imagine having 200 dogs in the same place at one time and trying to keep a hold of them all. By April 1st, Peary had sent everyone back except Matt and 4 of the Inuit men that were helping. And their names are Uta, Siglu, Ukwe, and Iganwa. For Peary could not get along without Matt Henson, experienced, resourceful, brave, and respected. Matt was better than anyone else at driving the dogs, fixing stoves and sledges, breaking and finding the trail, urging their Inuit companions on. Without Matt Henson, there would be no pole. Without the Eskimo dog, he says, the story of the North Pole would remain untold, for human ingenuity has not yet devised any other means to overcome the obstacles of cold, storm, and ice that nature has placed in the way. So when they couldn't go any farther by ship, they would pack all their supplies on these sledges here and harness the dogs to those sledges, and by the power of the dogs, they could pull them across the ice to their final destination. On April 3rd, as they moved across the ice, Matt slipped and fell through. Cold, killing water closed over his head, and he could not grasp the edge of the ice with his thick gloves. And this is his account of that. We were crossing a lane of moving ice. The block of ice I was using as a support slipped from underneath my feet, and before I knew it, the sledge was out of my grasp, and I was floundering in the water of the lead. So how did he get rescued? We'll see. Then in a flash, strong Uta was there. He grabbed Matt and pulled him out as if he were picking up a puppy by the scruff of its neck. He tore off Matt's sealskin boots, beat the water from his bearskin trousers, and saved the sledge and Mary Pulak's life. And then they simply kept on, just kept going. From now on, it was to keep on going and keep on, and we kept on. Sometimes in the face of storms of wind and snow that it is impossible for you to imagine. There you can see a seal. I wonder if they're going to make it. Sounds pretty hard. On April 6th, 1909, Peary planted a flag on a spot on the ice, the pole at last, or as close to it as they could figure. After 18 years, thousands of miles, the thin, tattered flag they always carried looked as ragged and worn as Peary and Matt themselves. For a few minutes, it hung limp and lifeless in the dead calm of the haze, and then a slight breeze, increasing in strength, caught the folds to straighten out, and soon it was rippling out in sparkling color. 3 hearty cheers rang out on the still frosty air, our dumb dogs looking on in puzzled surprise. So when they reached their destination all the way at the top of the world in the North Pole, they planted an American flag up there as a way to say that they were the first ones to explore that land. But now at last, these brave explorers could watch the flag fly from the top of the world. So they did ultimately find success in traveling to the North Pole, despite all the hardships. And that was in 1909. So, sounds like a pretty hard trip for them. And as I had mentioned before, they had to pack enough food to last for several years because they would really have no way of getting other food other than hunting. So one of the foods that they brought along with them was a thing called hardtack. And if you've never heard of hardtack, it's a very, very hard biscuit made out of flour and water and salt. And I made some as an example here. And as you can hear, it's like a brick. You can't even bite into it. So what they would do is they would make this, and it lasts for several years, doesn't go bad. But you'd have to soak it in water or soup or something like that for several minutes before you could even bite into it, because this will break your teeth if you try to bite it. And I'm going to show you how to make hardtack right now. It's actually pretty simple, and it may sound quite disgusting, but I tried it in my soup, and it was actually pretty good, so I was kind of surprised. So it just takes flour, water, and salt here. And so what you're going to do is take 2 cups of flour and pour it in the bowl here, and then add 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And this not only had a preserving quality, but it also gave it a little bit of flavor for something that would otherwise be very boring. And then 3/4 cup of water. And we're just gonna pour that in there and just mix it together. And it's gonna be pretty dry. You might have to use your hands, which I probably will have to do. Because after a while, this gets really hard to stir with a spoon. As you can see, it's coming together. All right, time to use my hands. And you're just gonna form a ball of dough with this. It's not supposed to be sticky, it's supposed to be really dry. The less moisture in it, the better, just because it'll last longer that way. So, coming together pretty much. There we go. See how the consistency of that? You can still kind of mold it with your hands, but it's not sticking to my fingers. So what you're going to do then is you're going to either roll it or pat it out to about a 1/2 inch thick. And if you haven't learned how thick an inch is yet, or 1/2 inch, then either help or ask for help from mom and dad, brother, sister, or get one of those rulers out and figure out where 1/2 inch is on that. All right, so once you get it to a 1/2 inch, this is an important part. So take your fork and just poke a bunch of holes in it, really deep, like all the way through. And this will help it to not puff up when you bake it. Make sure you poke holes all the way around. And then you get to cut it into squares, kind of like cracker size. And then since there's no baking soda or baking powder in this or anything like that, it'll pretty much keep its shape. It won't puff up, won't get bigger. And so once you have it all cut up into your shapes, you're going to put it on a baking sheet with parchment paper like I did here so it doesn't stick. And then bake it in your oven for 370 degrees, or at 370 degrees for about a 1/2 hour. And then after a 1/2 hour, you're going to take it out and flip these guys over. They're going to be start to turn brown at that point. And then you're going to stick it back in the oven and bake it for another 30 minutes. And then after the entire hour is up, you're going to end up with a piece of hardtack like that, and you can actually eat it. And this will last several years before it actually goes bad, like I said. So, and this, they would rely on this when all other foods went bad or spoiled or ran out. They would still have hardtack left to keep them alive. So that is how you make hardtack. And one more picture I wanted to show you. If I can find it, oh, it's right here. And I wanted to mention this because it's so interesting. It's called pemmican. And this is something I found out when I was reading these stories. It's another survival food that they used on their Arctic explorations back then. And let me read you a recipe for pemmican. And this comes from the Cranberry book, written in 1883 by Elizabeth Gemming. And it says, Indians mixed dried mashed cranberries with smoked venison, which is deer meat, a lot of fat, and wild onions. Boiled the mixture, pound it into a pulp, formed cakes, and dried them on rocks in the sun. And this was pemmican, a survival ration carried on long journeys by natives and later by white settlers. So, I don't know, that sounded pretty disgusting to me, but I guess if you were desperate for food, that would be a pretty good thing to eat. Sounds like it's pretty nutritious. So, that being said, now that you know how to make hardtack, now that you've learned a little bit about what it was like to explore the Arctic 100 years ago, perhaps that'll inspire you to go on your own adventures and maybe learn a little bit more about Matthew Peary or Robert Peary and Matthew Henson and some others that decided to go up to the North Pole and explore those regions. So I hope you had fun, and I'll see you next time for another History Hullabaloo. Bye.